Still on our top story tonight, Nigeria's 2024 budget proposal. Well, in a public presentation, the Minister of Budget and Economic Planning shed light on the intricate details of the budget. He emphasized that the budget was crafted to focus on revenue generation and expenditure management, aligning the economy for increased domestic investment. Well, some of the critical allocations in the 2024 money bill were highlighted during the presentation. The government has allocated substantial funds to enhance national defense and internal security, reflecting a commitment to ensuring the safety and well-being of all citizens.
Allocations, among others, the education sector, where at least 2.18, about 2.2 trillion, which is about 7.9% of the federal government budget, is allocated to education, which is higher than the 2023. Equally, the health sector received an increase in to about 1.4 trillion, 1.33 trillion, including immunizations. Equally, the defense and security sector received about 3.25 trillion, which is about 12% of the budget. This is quite significant, and especially following from the provision of close to 600 billion in the supplementary appropriation that was passed about 2 months ago to the defense and security sector. Equally, infrastructure spending, which is now 5% of the budget. And part of the instruction of Mr. President to the Cabinet is, as he has done in Lagos, bringing private sector into infrastructure. He has mandated all ministries to examine how to assess investors who are willing to put money in infrastructure. What the government can put in infrastructure is small compared to what the private sector can bring. Social development program, you may recall that a loan of $800 million was obtained from the World Bank to support the social development and poverty reduction, as well as the appropriation of 400 billion naira in the supplementary. In addition to that, now the sum of 534 billion, which is earmarked for social development and poverty reduction programs.
Well, for more on the intricacies of the budget, the Director General Budget Office of the Federation, Ben Alabueze, joins us now. Thank you for coming to Newsnight.
A pleasure.
Now, you've seen the breakdown of the budget, and it's looking quite ambitious. So we're beginning to look at the intricacies, the different allocations to the different sectors. How achievable is this budget?
Well, if we didn't think it was achievable, we wouldn't put it out. So we prepared it, so and that's because we think it is achievable. So if there's any specific component of it that you want to interrogate, maybe, we can discuss that. But if you want me to speak to the entire, we could be here all night.
For example, education, around 7%. It hasn't really achieved the 15% recommended by the United Nations. Health, still hovering around 5%. So it doesn't show much departure from what we've had, before now. Why should we really have hope in this renewed hope budget?
Well, first, let's get something clear.
Yeah.
Those ratios are national ratios. Okay? They are not the ratios for the central government. And in a federation, You have the federal government, you have the state government, you have the local governments, each of which has revenues, guaranteed constitutional authorities, and responsibilities. So if you take health, for instance, the current constitution of the Nigeria doesn't put any responsibility for health on the federal government, because health is neither on the exclusive nor concurrent legislative list, which means it is, in what is called the residual list, which is the responsibility of states.
Right.
So for you to then determine whether Nigeria is meeting the 15%, which by the way is not mandated by UN, but it's an aspirational number that African countries agreed to work towards. But for you to determine whether Nigeria is compliant, you'll have to aggregate the provisions of, for health by the federal, all the state and local governments in their budgets, and express as a percentage of their budgets to determine whether, that aggregate budget, to determine whether Nigeria is compliant. But oftentimes people just take the federal government's budget, run those ratios, and by the very definition
when it comes to the budget, you expect the subnationals to lead the charge, right?
No, that's not. I mean, what I'm saying here is, when it comes to responsibilities. So, for instance, defense, and security is primarily the responsibility of the federal government. And so you look at that budget, and you see there's 3.25 trillion naira for that, because that's the responsibility. In a federation, the expectation is that matters like health and and education and stuff like that are more the responsibility of the state government. So that's why, for instance, outside of the 106 or so unity colleges, the federal government doesn't have own secondary schools. The states have thousands and thousands of secondary schools. Same with primary schools and whatever. That's the nature of that responsibility. Ideally, the federal government would then be maybe in tertiary health institutions. But beyond the line, you need thousands of primary healthcare institutions, and which should be owned and operated by those other tiers of government. So I think we need to understand this and put the responsibility where it rightly belongs.
We understand that. You're saying that some of these sectors should be approached from the grassroots. At the state level.
I'm saying that is what I know, even by the design of the constitution.
Yes, right. We agree with that. But then, let me take you up on this. Our deficit is 9.18 trillion naira.
Yes.
Right. The current debt profile, 87.38 trillion. What it means is we're going to have to borrow 9.18 trillion naira. If we add that to 87.38 trillion naira, it's not looking like good arithmetic for a state like Nigeria. So
if development is really going to
happen, development is going to suffer for this. So how are you going to make up the figures?
You see, the issue is not whether you're adding 9 trillion naira. You'll have to do a debt sustainability analysis to determine. Look, Saudi Arabia, 34 million of them producing, 8 times as much oil as we are. At much lower cost, making all of that money. They're running a deficit budget. So, let's not make a whatever about this. Of course, it's, we need to be concerned about whether our debt is sustainable. And it's not just about arithmetic. It's not about arithmetic.
The question is whether it's sustainable. And we heard from the finance minister only last week, Wale was saying, look, Nigeria cannot continue to rely on borrowing to fund her budget, including, of course, the 2024 budget. In laying out these projections, have you factored in other revenue sources beyond oil, of course? And what are they? How exactly are they going to close the gap in a way that you might not necessarily have to go borrowing?
In the 2024 budget, estimates, oil accounts for just 43% of the projected revenues. 57% of that is from other sources, non-oil sources. So yes, and if you look at in the last 3 years, oil has underperformed even including in the current year. Oil is underperforming. And yet, as of the end of September, for the first time in a long time, revenue performance is 5% above budget as of end of September. The revenue performance end of September is 8.65 trillion naira, as against a rather budget of 8.28 trillion naira. But when you look at that, oil, is underperforming budget. Oil is only at 75% of the budget, whereas something like companies' income tax is over 200% of. So there's a focus on driving non-oil revenues, but the reality again is this, and this is what oftentimes people, if you take a 27.5 trillion naira budget for the federal government, it's still way too small relative to our needs.
Okay.
Right. But the reason why it is that low is because we do not have the revenues to support a larger budget.
You spoke about the subnationals earlier. Let me take you back there.
Yes.
How does your office, indeed the federal government, or how will you work in tandem in a way that truly the subnationals will lead the charge when it comes to ensuring inflation is down, for example, and coming up with the developmental strides or policies that can actually reflect in the lives of the ordinary Nigerian? Because you come up with these budgets, 23 trillion, whatever the trillions are, it must reflect in the lives of Nigerians.
Absolutely. When you look at the key drivers of inflation in Nigeria, one, you've got food inflation for several years now has been running above the composite CPI number. Okay, so that means that we need to step up food production. That's really up the streets of the subnational governments. Second, you have structural factors which include access roads to be able to the farms, better storage facilities to minimize wastage. Wastage. These are the things that will help lower costs. Investments also in transportation infrastructure will also reduce the cost of operations. So generally, investments in infrastructure across the country will help lower the cost and deal with some of those structural factors. There are also impediments to business, and that's why the effort to improve the business environment now is not just a federal. If you look at all of the World Bank doing business rankings, and you look at the factors that are that are tracked, a lot of them are the responsibilities of subnational governments, whether it is development, earning permits, and whatever, and all of those right of way. That's so this federation, the federal and the subnational governments must work collectively and in the same direction to be able to move this economy in the right direction.
That's well understood. Projected expenditures 27.5 trillion naira. Out of this, capital expenditure is only 8.7 trillion naira, meaning that recurrent expenditure is taking the larger chunk. Yet again, this has always been the case. Where does this leave development when we're still talking about cutting the cost of governance in Nigeria?
You see, first of all, I'll make two major comments. First, in that 27.5 trillion naira, 8.5 trillion is debt service. Okay, so you'll have to back that out before you start determining what is.
That makes the situation even worse, if you ask me.
No, you were suggesting that once you take out 8.7, then everything else is recurrent.
No, I just wanted to. No, okay, then 8.7. I just wanted to save your time. Yeah. Okay, so let's do the maths the way you want us to do the maths now. Capital expenditure 8.7 trillion naira, and we're still spending 8.25 trillion naira to service debt. it makes the matter even worse, if you ask me.
That's the cumulative cost of all the debt that you have taken in the last. Nigeria hasn't repaid.
And we're planning to take another 9.18 trillion naira in this 2024
all right,
budget.
so the option is this, okay? Take first of all, out of the 9.1, just to be clear, out of the 9.18 trillion, 258 billion is coming from privatization. So it's not the 9, but doesn't change the number a whole lot. So almost 9 trillion in new debt, out of which, okay, over 1 trillion is concessional, multilateral debt drawdown. But so take that out of the 27.5, you'll be down to 18.5. So
Okay.
if 18.5, which is your revenue, is 18.32, so no debt, you just want to spend your revenue. So
All right.
you will still have to pay, okay, if it's not 8.25, you still have to pay at least 7.5 on the existing stock of your debt.
Right.
And you will have to still cover the 6.5 trillion naira of employee and pension wages.
Well,
when you add the two,
yeah.
your revenue is gone.
Well,
So-
what all of that means is that
So nobody is borrowing because they prefer to borrow.
Right,
It's just an imperative until we fix our core challenge, which is inadequate government revenues.
Right. That means a thinking cap has to be really put on. Professor Ben Alabueze, Director General, Budget Office of the Federation. Thank you so much.
Just awarded me a professorship on Arise Live.
Why not? Ben Alabueze, thank you so much for joining us. DG, Budget Office, Federation of Nigeria. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my pleasure.